Education is a key issue on the agenda of this year's United Nations General Assembly since 2014 was the last year for both the Millennium Development Goals and the Dakar Education for All goals, both agreed in 2000. The broad concept of promoting education and the right to education has been part of the United Nations mandate for many years, as several declarations and resolutions have aimed to address the issue. Education crept into global conversation of human rights in Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it has generally stuck in the dialogue over the years through a number of treaties and declarations. The Education for All program has been one of the more recent pushes towards education and has partly been included in the 8 Millennium Development Goals as well. Unfortunately, this and other similarly lofty programs and declarations have not always achieved what they had promised. 2015 has already arrived, and the EFA goals, along with the MDG of achieving universal primary education for all, have not been reached in many countries and are certainly not going to be achieved by the end of 2015. Although the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a landmark declaration and called on governments to provide education for all, it was devoid of much legal standing as, like many other declarations passed after that, it was non-binding and did not really require any direct action on the part of the members of the UN. Yet, in the midst of major civil rights reform in the United States and elsewhere during the 1960s, the UN finally passed binding conventions that dealt with education and held countries responsible for fulfilling the promises made within. In stark contrast to the relative timidity and passiveness of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, these conventions were fairly straightforward in ensuring that governments recognized that the right to education for all is not simply blank rhetoric, but is instead a very real responsibility. The Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights binds its members to provide free primary education and to ensure that other levels of education, such as secondary and tertiary education, are also made accessible to all. Yet, along with Belize, Comoros, Cuba, Palau, Sao Tome and Principe, and South Africa, the United States is surprisingly one of the 7 member states that has signed on to the Covenant but have never ratified it. The Convention on the Rights of the Child was also a particular landmark for the United Nations, as it is one of its most widely ratified treaties. 194 member states have ratified it. It calls upon all member states to take responsibility by obligating them to recognize the right of the child to an education and the responsibility of states to provide it for all without discrimination. Yet, despite the unprecedented global ratification of the convention, 3 member states have still not ratified it: Somalia, South Sudan, and surprisingly again the United States. The argument for not ratifying the convention in the United States, a country that often sees itself as a bastion of civil rights, is that the Senate needs to give its consent to any treaty before ratifying, and many politicians do not wish to give up sovereignty over their own laws just to be held accountable for enforcing policies they may not want to enforce. All the aforementioned developments in the international legal system since 1948 had very broad mandates that included education for sure, but it took until 1990 for the United Nations to officially adopt a declaration focused solely on providing education for all. During a conference in Jomtien, Thailand, the World Declaration on Education for All was adopted that laid out 12 targets for the delegates to achieve by 2000. Yet, by 1996, when the countries got together again in Amman, Jordan, to assess the progress being made, they declared that significant progress was still not being made, despite 50 million more children being enrolled in schools and approximately 20 million fewer primary-age children that were out of school than in 1990. The deadline for the Jomtien goals came and passed at the turn of the century, but the goals had still not been achieved, although significant progress was made. UNESCO then issued the most in-depth evaluation of basic education ever undertaken, titled the EFA 2000 Assessment. The results of this assessment were announced in the World Education Forum in Dakar, Senegal, held in April 2000, where 164 states got together and adopted the Dakar Framework for Action, which listed 6 key education goals to reach by 2015. Yet, soon after the Dakar conference ended, the UN held the Millennium Summit, which effectively contained the first international development agenda of the 21st century in the form of 8 Millennium Development Goals. The MDGs, unlike the broader, more visionary declaration, were not developed in a systematic and consultative manner. This, plus the need to include goals from many different sectors, led to a document which left out most of the Dakar EFA goals. These MDGs shifted the global focus on simply achieving universal primary education as an end goal, while the Dakar framework was carefully constructed to ensure that several major issues of education were tackled thoroughly and not simply focus on interpreting primary level education for all as the end goal in and of itself. In terms of providing primary level education for all, the UN achieved tremendous progress and momentum between 2000 and 2010 as the number of out-of-school children dropped by almost 37 million. Yet, the momentum decreased significantly as the global primary out-of-school rate has been stuck at 9% since 2007, and according to recent figures, there are still nearly 58 million children of primary level age that are still out of school. The problem is also more highly concentrated in certain countries, as India, Indonesia, Niger, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Sudan each have more than 1 million children out of school. The increasing number of children in primary school, albeit a promising sign, still does not help to reach the end goal of all the UN's major declarations, as the number of children that are dropping out of school still remains staggeringly high. The rate of dropping out of early school, 25%, has surprisingly remained at the same level since 2000. This is highly relevant to the 58 million children that are still out of school, as figures state that at least 23% of those children had some schooling at some point but dropped out due to various reasons. The World Bank in 2003 effectively highlighted the problematic nature of simply focusing on getting children into school as an end goal. A growing body of research states that to generate sustainable mastery of basic competencies, a child must have at least 5 to 6 years of basic schooling. The data shows that attending 3 years of schooling has a very limited impact as compared to the direct benefits and externalities linked to the completion of 5 or 6 years of schooling, which is the average primary level cycle. Hence, the World Bank recommends it would make much more sense to formulate the second MDG goal as universal primary completion rather than universal primary enrollment. The presence of conflict has also dragged out progress in several countries, as roughly half of the world's out-of-school population lives in conflict-ridden areas. Conflict is such a great hurdle for education for all, particularly because it is extremely tough to negotiate education reform with governments, parents, educators, or even humanitarian organizations in places like Iraq, Syria, and Pakistan. Yet, these conflicts should not deprioritize education, something that is currently being seen as some vague long-term target, but instead should put greater emphasis on it as these areas are the ones that need it the most. Almost 95% of the 28.5 million children out of school in conflict areas are from low and lower middle income countries, which only serves to highlight the economic costs associated with education. Schools are also at a risk of being targeted in conflict areas by armed groups, as was the case with the recent Peshawar incident that killed more than 140 children attending school. Entire generations of children are currently missing out on education in Syria and Liberia, and these children are likely to suffer throughout their lives. Hence, the leaders of these countries need to ensure that education is a central priority. Another major issue with achieving education reform is that many countries, even highly developed ones like the United States, consider several UN efforts to be an intervention in their domestic affairs. The problem with such treaties is that they have to be approved by several political stakeholders, some of whom, like the Congress, are unwilling to compromise on the basis of sovereignty and claim that their own constitution affords the same rights to US citizens. Despite what the politicians may claim, the United States is actually falling behind on a number of children's rights indicators, as it is ranked 30th out of 34 OECD countries in terms of child poverty. It is the only high-income country that does not grant maternity leave, and is also the one country in the world that sentences offenders under the age of 18 to life in prison without parole, which the convention openly opposes. Finally, many countries need to spend a much greater amount on education that have been unwilling to do so in the past if EFA goals are to ever be achieved. There is currently a $26 billion financing gap, and yet a greater number of donors are looking to cut their aid amounts. This gap is expected to rise to $38 billion once the post-2015 education goals are implemented. According to the latest EFA report, if only 67 low and middle income countries expand their tax base and devote one fifth of their budget to education, they could raise an additional $153 billion for education in 2015. Yet, the most problematic aspect of this recommendation is that many countries fail to generate even 20% of their GDP through taxes, and hence have even lower amounts to spend on education. Pakistan generates only 10% of its GDP through tax revenue, but if it is only able to increase its revenue to 14% and give one fifth of this revenue to education, it could put all Pakistani children into schools, according to UNESCO figures. Although the future may seem bleak if you consider the enormous challenges that must be conquered, there have been various countries that have stepped up to these challenges and conquered them. 17 countries with more than 100,000 children out of school in 2000 were able to cut this number by more than half by 2012. These 17 countries were collectively able to reduce their out of school children by 86%. Nepal and Morocco are terrific examples of such countries, as Nepal cut its out of school population by 660,000 by the end of 2013, and Morocco cut its out of school population by 930,000. These countries followed a number of similar policies to get their success, while making a series of compromises along the way for the long-term development of their country. These policies included fee abolition, increasing expenditure on education, increasing attention to ethnic and linguistic minorities, overcoming conflict, and increasing the quality as well as the quantity of education. Although the momentum towards achieving the EFA goals by 2015 may have come to a halt, great progress was nevertheless made, and certain governments have led the way in implementing tremendous change through their policies. Now, it's time for other countries to follow suit.